Senegal is battling a mounting debt crisis. It all unfolded last year after a review of the nation's finances uncovered $7 billion in hidden borrowing by the previous government. That is more than 1/5 of the country's GDP. This led the International Monetary Fund to freeze almost $2 billion in loans, while rating agencies downgraded the country's credit further into junk. The new government says that it must now raise taxes and cut public spending in order to address the shortfall. But critics warn that austerity could backfire, slowing growth, sapping the very tax revenue that it seeks to raise. Nicholas Hack reports from Dakar.
Adama loved to play football, a game he will never be able to play again. Having to use a wheelchair, his only caregiver is his dying mother. Jazeera has cancer. Treatment is out of reach, and so time is slipping away fast. Perhaps in a year, her 6 children will be left alone, with a fridge bare of food, filled with their belongings. Gone is the $40 welfare grant she received every 3 months from the government. And so she survives on loans, debts her children will one day inherit.
I feel blessed because despite everything, he is alive and I can spend my time with him. But the disability is hard on us. Everything we have goes to his care.
500,000 families in Senegal have lost the welfare payments that kept them alive. The government cut the program after the IMF froze vital funding. Auditors later uncovered $7 billion in hidden debt concealed by the previous administration. Now the IMF demands austerity before releasing new money, a move critics say holds struggling Senegalese hostage.
When President Macky Sall and his government contracted this debt, the IMF said that the debt was sustainable. The IMF said that this debt was productive. The IMF said that this was a good debt. Today, we discovered that this debt was neither sustainable nor productive, but worse, we have uncovered hidden debt. And so the question is, where was the IMF? Did the IMF lie to us? Did the IMF prioritize the interests of Senegal's creditors over the interests of Senegalese citizens?
Politicians promised oil and gas would bring prosperity, fueling hope for many. Instead, Senegal's debt has grown drastically, becoming one of Africa's most indebted nations. Look at Dakar's skyline, rising but half-built. It tells the story of Senegal's debt, borrowed money fueling construction, leaving soaring bills behind. Most of it is owed to local banks, not foreign lenders. Now families have to pay the price. The new prime minister is raising taxes, halting projects, and imposing visa fees.
You get the impression that there's a desire to suffocate the country, but the country is still holding together. A lot of people say to us, but how are you coping with this situation? The country is still holding together. And my wish is that we will be able to get out of this situation through the efforts we will have made with this recovery plan.
But activists say canceling the debt, not imposing austerity, that will end what seems like an endless cycle of poverty, passed from one generation to another. Nicholas Hack, Al Jazeera Dakar for Counting the Cost.
So what does Senegal do next? That's what we're asking Gospel Obele, an African economist for Streetnomics, a Nigerian think tank. And Gospel, you're joining us from London. So from one day to another, Senegal just suddenly realizes it has a lot more debt than it thought. Is there a playbook for how to handle something like that?
Well, to start with, thank you very much, Cyril, for having me today. It's a culture that is significantly hidden when it comes to how public finances work and governance to a large extent, particularly in developing economies. The thing around government leakages, fiscal leakages, and poor responsibility when it comes to managing public finance and the like. So we've seen that that culture has led to significant debt challenges, in Africa, particularly how debt monies are spent, how debt monies are being used to sort of facilitate capital expenditure, growth and development within the context, in that African nation. So it's significantly the culture around things. And until that cultural landscape or the behavior around how public finance officials or government think about debt or debt monies or debt finance in the first case, we might not really be able to, make some form of significant progress when it comes to situations like this.
It does raise the question of debt forgiveness, right? That just means canceling the debt. Is something like that feasible?
Well, it's feasible. I mean, we've seen that in the case of Nigeria when the Paris Club cancelled the Nigerian debt via a restructuring process in 2003. Yes, it's possible, but it's significantly speaking, in the Senegalese case now, the debt to GDP ratio is significantly above 100%. So there are huge concerns. There are bigger issues around the leakages that exist in the local economy. So in terms of investors' confidence or creditors' confidence to begin talks around restructuring or forgiveness, that's really, really, really a very, very almost impossible situation. So there has to be a promise to show that Senegal has got what it takes to rework its position back towards debt sustainability before restructuring to start with. So I don't really think or know or believe in that case that creditors may find confidence in the process, towards debt forgiveness in any significant way. So the Senegalese government may have to probably show more proof that it has what it takes to become sustainable with its debt.
Right. So let's take debt forgiveness off the table. And you've explained that it's just very rare. It has happened, but it's very rare. The Senegalese government is currently saying what all governments that are faced with a huge amount of debt say. They say, well, we're going to have to spend less money. That means cut public spending. And we're going to have to raise revenue. That means increase taxes. There's a word for all that. It's austerity. And our reporter, Nicholas Hack, showed us the effect of austerity. It means that ordinary Senegalese people who depend on government help and government spending, some of them won't be getting it in the future. Is austerity the answer?
I don't think austerity is completely the answer. It might sound like a necessary condition to have now, but again, it's not sufficient. And if you look at things from a more sufficient context, these are the critical lines that impact on the socioeconomic well-being of individuals in a particular state. You talk about poverty. Poverty levels are high, over 50%. Over half of the population in Senegal currently live below the poverty line. You've got youth unemployment significantly high, over 19 to 20%, amongst those between ages 15 to 24. So that's significant local socioeconomic challenges and issues, as the case may be. And then again, it speaks to the fact that we aren't discussing or talking about the major thing in the room, the elephant in the room, which talks about the leakages in society, the weakness of MDAs or ministry departments and associations, or how generally the culture around public finance, how it works, not just in Senegal, but in Africa. Now beginning to think of how we can use austerity measures to win over the debt argument is technically presenting itself as a trade-off on socioeconomic lines. So I do not believe that is the most sustainable route to go. I think the institutions need to begin to look at themselves in the mirror, to begin to ask the critical questions around what are the leakages to start with, what are the low-hanging fruit that we probably need to close, what gaps needs to be closed to find ourselves back again in terms of prospect for debt sustainability, prospect for debt restructuring. There are also low-hanging fruits when it comes to the MSME sector in Senegal. How are we galvanizing those opportunities to increase revenue, all right, in the case, and how are we mobilizing investments towards high return sectors in the local economy? So these are low-hanging conversations that we must have, within the Senegalese case, to begin to look at how sustainable, the debts can be to start with. I do not think that austerity measures are the most sustainable routes to go, and I do not personally believe that it would be. I think there's going to be some form of counter effects, to taking that route, and which might further cripple the economy socioeconomically.
Well, Gospel, you mentioned that there are some low-hanging fruit. Here's the one I had in mind. Senegal just became, late last year and earlier this year, an oil and gas producer. It is now selling oil and gas, which wasn't the case before. Could that be the get-out-of-jail-free card that fixes Senegal's finances if that oil and gas revenue comes in? Well,
very interesting. It could be a potential get-out-of-jail-free card. That's if Senegal chooses to work around its oil and gas sector in such a way that it's much more competitively viable in the international market. And what that means, for instance, if you look at the case of Nigeria, we've got crude oil, but we don't have vibrant refineries. So we're technically selling the raw materials, and that's also, the raw crude, and that's impacting on imported inflation because we then have to import the finished product. So if Senegal takes cue from economies like Nigeria, it will then begin to think of how to ensure that its oil, its crude, as the case may be, is being revamped and value processed in such a way that it can gain much more value from that, value chain of some sort. Until that is done significantly, and also looking at the non-oil sector, the low-hanging fruit around the MSME sectors, those who are producing, ready to export and all that, how are you mobilizing that segment in the economy, or those economic agents, to be much more competitive, not just in the global landscape, but also in the regional landscape? So these are low-hanging fruit conversations that we must have. What sort of infrastructure investment need to be done to unlock the viability of those low-hanging, to start with? Until that is being considered as a conversation or worthwhile investment, I do not see the Senegalese economy significantly taking the most advantage of its new breakthrough within the oil and gas space. And also take into consideration the world of clean energy, where gas comes to play in the context of Africa's journey towards clean energy and all of that. So there's a huge prospect on the table, but the conversation has to be around how are we competitively viable in context to how the global economy now evolves when it comes to oil and gas. And I think that is where the breakthrough might really come from.
Gospel Obele of Streetnomics, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me, Cyril.